So what I thought I'd do today for this lecture is present a bit of the project we undertook. It's a collaborative project. I'm the PI for 3 seasons, 2018, 19, and then 22. But we also did field work in 2017 and 2021. And today and tomorrow I'm going to talk about the 2 digital mapping projects that I had taken up, and both are in some ways, in some capacity, collaborative projects. This project is called Mapping the Ephemeral. And of course, by its very title, it's somewhat oxymoronic, because if it's ephemeral, it's very difficult to map. One of the points I was making in the lecture in the morning is that the difficulty of mapping the Gangetic Plains is that the relation between land and water is so ephemeral that if you cannot have fixed points, fixed lines, it's difficult to represent those in a map. So knowing full well that we are talking about a short-term event, which is the Durga Puja in Kolkata, we took up the challenge of thinking about how we can do this. Now, before I begin the project discussion, I want to have a little discussion about what ephemeral means and what durational imagination is. We have been talking about spatial imagination, but there is also something called durational imagination, temporal imagination, time imagination. We had discussed a little of that in the very first day, on the very first day when we talked about David Harvey's notion of the relationship between money, time, and space. But one thing is very interesting about the architectural profession, and same thing with urbanism, that it has what I call the prejudice of permanence. It presumes everything it builds is meant to last a long time. We don't really have a good vocabulary to talk about buildings which do not last a long time. And what else is that, terms such as ephemeral, short-term, impermanent, temporary are kind of mixed up. They're used as if they're interchangeable. They're not interchangeable. Given that all built works have a temporal horizon, because it's something to do with the materials used, the system of construction, the desirability of its lasting, all built works have a temporal horizon. Now, the prejudice of permanence arises from certain state-centric notions of what is desirable in a built form. Since I showed you the plan of Versailles yesterday, I believe, it's a very good example of what was desired in the late 17th century by the French state. And this is, if you think of the plan as a diagram of power, the particular articulation of power, it projected the state's permanence in very physical form. And this became a kind of a spatial visual rhetoric. What it proposed was a kind of a durable state, the notion of a durable state. And durability, again, has very little to do with ephemeral or permanence. This is the thing I want you to understand. The notion of, state-centric planning, big buildings, became such an important part of planning per se and architectural projects that we find that vocabulary, the sort of the projected permanence, the diagram of power, translated into many city plans later, including the one in New Delhi, which is also a neo-Baroque plan. So there is a kind of a lineage of thinking about urban plans as durable structures. And these are, of course, spectacular. They're meant to be, produce a certain visual experience, meant to produce a certain spatial experience. They're very choreographed. and they project a certain vision of sovereignty. Now, what happened is that, this notion of, durability, permanence, received a bit of a jolt even while these were being, produced in the late 19th, early 20th century, because capitalism desired and demanded that even if you are producing something, let's say you're producing some object that and that object can be a building, that even when it's not, even when it is functional, when it remains functional, it must be devalued, so something else can be built in its place. That's the logic of capitalism. That is, it requires that new production every cycle, depending on how long the cycle is. So buildings that had not, they are still functional in terms of its use, they are not falling apart, are routinely brought down to be replaced by other structures. It is very common, and that is the logic of capitalism. And the term that was coined in the early 20th century was obsolescence. Obsolescence means that you are making something obsolete so that something else can replace that what is obsolete. And that has something to do, again, with creating not only new opportunities for investment, whether it's in built form or in, on other products, but also a result of unprecedented mobility of goods, services, and people. So the way it kind of manifested itself in the realm of planning is that, here were architects who wanted to create these durable structures, things that last for a long time, carrying their legacy and legacy of their patrons. At the same time, capital demanded that they be brought down and something else be built in their place. So this is what I call the dual faith, a long-term spatial future that will last for a long time, and an uninterrupted flow of capital, because this is the problem. For capital to flow, things must be destroyed and then rebuilt. In other words, you need to create new opportunities for reinvestment. So one of the aspects, and we don't need to get into it in detail, is that what came out of it, these kind of practices, these kinds of propositions, is that kind of a durable infrastructure in terms of zoning law. We can talk about zoning laws later. Techniques of population enumeration and fixity came into became part of planning practice. We don't need to get into the details of that. What I want you to understand is that permanence, the idea that something will last a long time or something is there to exist for a long time, has actually nothing to do with durability, which means that the condition of permanence or impermanence is political, and it is economic. So economic calculations go into it, and so do political, which means that permanence is not only not about durability, it is about perpetuating social contract. Let me give you an example. You may build a shanty, let's say a slum dwelling, with bricks, which is a durable material. But if you are building on land you don't own, which is illegally, then it can be brought down any time. It has nothing to do with the durability of the structure. It has to do with the legal constraints and the social contract. Okay, is that clear? Not clear? Okay. I'm seeing heads moving all kinds of ways, so I'm not sure. The reason permanence, the very idea of permanence is durability, which is a complete fiction, lasted because it gave opportunities for strategic inclusion and exclusion. It could be ethnic, it could be racial, it could be class-based. It's, in other words, who belongs in a city and who doesn't. I would highly recommend reading Sheetal Chabria's book on Making the Modern Slum. This is a story of colonial Bombay, where she talks about how materials which were durable had nothing to do with whether they were considered um, allowable or permanent enough to remain. In other words, she shows that certain kinds of dwellings were actually excluded from the city, irrespective of whether they were durable or not. So keep this in mind, because permanence and political culture has a particular sort of resonance when we talk about anything ephemeral in urban space. So permanence, to put it very bluntly, signals the absence of property rights in urban situation. In other words, impermanence is linked to the absence of property rights, and permanence, even if the building is not meant to last 200 years, is linked to property rights. And this again has a very long tradition. During colonial rule, whether it's in Australia, in North America, in this part of the subcontinent, the absence of what was understood to be durable housing became an excuse for dispossessing indigenous people of land en masse. This was the rule, because they were deemed to have no permanent claim to the land, because their housing didn't seem, they're not built of bricks and stone and so on and so forth. And this was fairly routine. Now, the fact is, if we now think about, instead of permanence, impermanence, we think about short term. Short term doesn't mean it's not legal or anything like that. If the state deems or allows something short term, it is allowed to flourish, actually. So one of the classic examples in architectural history or planning history is the temporary, it was called the White City, that was built for the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. These are the images you're looking at. This is the image you're looking at. Look at these buildings. It's a central axis. They all look like they are neoclassical. They look like permanent buildings. They were actually meant to be not permanent. They were actually temporary structures, like the ones that are built in a fair. This is after all a World's Fair. Now, this of course has a different resonance because the state is supporting this. And this is something to keep in mind, no matter whether you're talking about a fair situation, a festival, where impermanent structures are built and they're authorized by the state. And then of course there is, it is kind of somewhat amusing, and this is a picture I took in Singapore, where this is a discussion about, is there, what is public space? As if there's going to be a public debate. And this is in a city which space is extremely controlled by the state. Okay, so the notion of public space, which requires somewhat free access, unfettered access, is not quite available in that city. It's very regulated. So it's something to think about, the relation between public space, the ability to build so-called permanently or impermanently, and the sort of claim to the city through building activities. And they could be hawker stalls, they could be housing, and they could be festive structures built for festive reasons. So the term ephemeral has many, many meanings, and this is the kind of a laundry list of what they mean. It's ephemeral, when I was tearing up that dollar note, because it's destructible material. That's what ephemeral is. That's one thing. But sensations like light, sound, smell, because they don't last, that's also ephemeral, passing. Interpersonal exchange. We have a conversation. It's not recorded. That's ephemeral. But it also can be, let's say, a case of a soccer match or something like that, in the momentary, affective, event, that something that happens at a particular moment, which is not really capturable in situ, except for being part of that in that moment. That is ephemeral, and that could be collective affect. And of course, there are interventions that are not meant to last a long time. That could be posters which are torn, wall writing, political wall writing including. And it could be illuminations and waterworks that can be turned off. See, these are the, all of these in the sort of larger realm of architectural history and planning history, all of these are considered in some capacity ephemeral. And of course, so are what are considered temporary habitations, camps, border settlements, despite the fact, this includes refugee camps, despite the fact that they could be there for decades. Okay? Because of their status, they are considered ephemeral. And these meanings sort of slide into each other. The fact that the ephemeral can be highly political is very evident in the case of wall writing. This is an example of the wall writing that was painted over in Hong Kong in 2019 as political protest boomed. And it actually, the reason this was photographed because it became kind of an artwork in itself, because the state will not tolerate, slogans, commentaries that it does not agree with. Okay? So that's also ephemeral. Ephemeral has tremendous power. In my second book, Unlearning the City, I wrote about political wall writing and why it was sort of mobilized as a very important instrument for political activities is because it does something in public space that like a written text or book cannot do. Every kind of text has its own role. Every medium has its own role. And this is the example, and this is the Intifada continues. This is an excellent article by Judy Petit, the writing of the on the walls graffiti of the Intifada. And this was very interesting because this is, communities within, these are Palestinians communicating amongst themselves. Some of it against the Israeli state, but most of it's really between each other because it is a public forum for discussion. Now, states, of course, don't like that. But Durga Puja, and this is where it is a short-lived event, it's a 5-day event technically, though it is stretched out now and sort of extended and to become longer, but it is a 5-day Hindu religious event. And there is a process associated with it, but it's also recognizable as an event which has a beginning and which has an end. So, and this is a kind of interesting phenomenon because as a late 19th to early 21st century phenomenon, Durga Puja in public space goes beyond its religious reason, purpose for celebration, and has a wide secular remit. The secular remit historically has something to do with the fact that it was tied to the nationalist movement. We can discuss that later, but it is an important, it's a historical function of Durga Puja in Calcutta. Now, what happens in Durga Puja? Durga Puja is celebrated in private homes as well as in public space. The event in public space takes a particular form and it has evolved over the 20th century. And it is, these elaborate structures, pandals, are constructed in fields, on streets, on any open space. I'm going to discuss how we categorize these open spaces. Now, the smallest pandal, and this is an example of a really small intervention. Nothing can be more simple than this. It's a small rectangular structure. There's a dais here on which you'll put the deity, the idol, and there are some steps leading up to it. This is mounded, it's like a little stoa actually. And this is, of course, bamboo construction, and there is fabric on it. And this is really small. This is one, and you find these actually all over the city. It is incorrect to think that all Durga Puja pavilions who follow Durga Puja are large. That's actually not true. Many of them are really modest. Okay? So These are some of the drawings we had done over the process. But Durga Puja has a certain materiality which is very interesting in terms of the use of materials, very innovative use of materials to produce particular visual, spatial effect and affect. You're expected to be awed. And that kind of effort is carried on by, very well-known designers. There are people who call themselves wood panel designers. This didn't exist in the 60s, 70s. They were decorators who just put together a pavilion and then you did your puja. These are important to note. If you don't know about Durga Puja, these are held mostly by neighborhood associations. These are voluntary associations that do it. So, use of paper, and there's something very ephemeral about that. Light materials are desirable because you're going to build it and you're going to take it off after 5 days. They have to go after 5 days. So there's some calculations about materials go into that, or must go into that. But then extraordinary artistry comes out of handling materials in terms of light, in terms of texture, how you build a wall. These are some of the examples. We can come back to it. And, the innovation in terms of even thinking about what a wall can be, that you can use just different kinds of threads and cords to create a wall thickness. It's quite extraordinary. So there is multiple reasons to think about Durga Puja as something worth studying carefully. Partly it is the artistry, and I am interested in the artistry. I'm interested in the design aspect of it. And this one, for example, this is Bimal Travankar's design in 2019. These are actually hanging from the top. The material, the primary material is supari leaves, betel nut leaves, which have been folded, managed, pressed, and done into the entire structure is actually constructed out of that. Certainly, no one knows how to build with that. So, not only the designer, but the workers, he has his own crew, who they have to figure out how to actually do this. In other words, and like exceptional adaptability to materials are on display if you notice carefully. What was interesting about this is that, these were actually hung from the top and they swayed in the breeze. The day I took this picture, it was actually raining, and there was a light breeze, and these were intended because it rains during the Puja. It's very well known. So very subtle interventions in design can happen, whereas very kind of a large, let's call them loud interventions. So this was the structure that I just mentioned, the main structure. And it looks nothing like that little modest panel I showed you earlier. It looks very modernist, and that was the intention. And just the light work and all of these, these are like lanterns which were intended to sway in the breeze. So there are a lot of definitions of ephemeral you can think of that you can muster and think of use in terms of thinking through these designs. Let's just give you how difficult some of these constructions can be. And mind you, the Calcutta Police, you do require the permission of the Calcutta Police to actually construct these. There is a very nominal permission system in terms of the electricity, and primarily the electricity and the permission of the police. Now, and there's also the police is because of mainly traffic safety, but it gives some organizers up to 3 months to build their structures. So that's pretty much what you're looking at. So anything you do, you'd have to do off-site in workshops before you bring them to the site. So you have to plan this out, and you have 1 year to plan, right? Now, this one, for example, this is Chetla Grugani, and the inside of the ceiling was actually a model of the entire city of Calcutta, 3-dimensionally. Which is, it's very difficult to build. B, it is a tremendous effort to mount it. and that too in such a short time frame. So we're talking about, let's call it extreme skill. Okay, that's the only way I can think about it. And I've spent a lot of time in these pavilions while they're being constructed to understand how the work, to understand the workflow. And it is quite extraordinary, and the ability of the workers to adapt to new materials, figure out how to create a finished product within such a short time, with lighting, music, and every aspect, and it still needs to abide by basic safety conditions. There are huge in traffic impact of crowds and traffic. Now, Durga Puja, all these pavilions, they come from a very let's call it a static urban mode. So once Durga Puja started being celebrated in the 18th century, late 18th century, in elite households, one of the buildings, the area of Calcutta I showed you, was this one. This is Shauhaja Rajbari, and a space like this in front of a very public koja, so this is equivalent to this space, in a double arcade here, became the definition of what a public Thakur Dalan is. A Dalan means a veranda basically, meant for religious worship. And it is completely, this is a proscenium setting, and this is actually, it differed significantly from its rural counterparts, the way it was adapted and inserted within an urban form. So this is the basic idea. In other words, a platform, steps, and a ground in front is what is replicated in all panels with more or less elaboration. Some of them are far more elaborate. So the quick history, 1911 is considered the first Sarvajanic open to all puja, because before that it was inflected by caste and restricted by caste. And then it got connected to anti-colonial nationalism, and the fact that it started happening in public spaces meant that you have to consider the parameters of the specific public space that it is being built in. In other words, you cannot create the same thing everywhere. It has to be catered to, the design has to cater to the specific site. So a lot of thoughts go into how this can be done. So this is a very ordinary neighborhood in the south of Calcutta, with a good chunk of older early 20th century buildings. There are some late 19th century buildings. And a site like that can be transformed to this in a matter of days. This is actually, they rebuilt the New York skyline. And a bunch of it was, tongue-in-cheek. It had elements which were clearly because you're scaling up. What they did was, this is entirely bamboo and paper. And this was a 100 feet tall structure. So you need to know how to actually put this together without endangering any lives. And then they used in this Garisk pavilion very thin gauge aluminum as the envelope. So structures like this, and there's a good bit of humor also goes into it. This is what the structure actually, this is the kind of structure would get built. And then you have, of course, the Brooklyn Bridge abutting into a 3-story building. So you know the manipulation of scale. So nobody's hiding it. So there's a good deal of humor, good deal of skill, and good deal of understanding the specific parameters. So when we started, I had this funny idea that we should map Durga Puja. In 2017, I worked on Durga Puja, I've written about Durga Puja before, but in 2017 I was visiting Calcutta, and I looked at some structures, including Bimal Tramanto's work, and I thought it's worth studying again, because something had changed in terms of the complexity of the designs themselves. In other words, also how they negotiate urban space. So in 2018, I put together a team, I usually do all my research by myself. Because this was a short durational event, I wanted to map every Durga Puja pandal in the city. So I needed a team of researchers. So I got together 7 groups of 2, meaning that included me, and I did most of the wards. So each individual person was responsible for mapping n number of wards. There are 144 wards in Kolkata, and we were also trying to kind of figure out, other aspects of how much space they take up, some kind of details of construction. So we said, okay, from that, we want all those mapped, and then we want to study 14 sites in detail. And they would select 14 based on their promises, their significance. And when we were planning, we thought, okay, we would use some overlays to think about distribution and clustering, because distribution is uneven across the city. Why some wards have many more Durga Pujas than others, it begs a question of why. How do you explain that? Is it to do with demographics? Is it to do with infrastructural capacity, or has to do with something else? Has to do with socioeconomic conditions? It's actually none of those. It's something else. We're going to talk about the findings later. And then the plan was to produce analytic text, reports, videos. We did profuse documentation. The last plan was to how to kind of integrate all of this into one coherent whole, one both on a digital platform and also as a hard copy that usual publication form. So what we did, and this is I had to think about how to do this. The first thing that was necessary to do this was to have a ward map of Kolkata. Now, most cities, perhaps, at least cities in the US, you would be able to get, let's say, a borough map or something like that. Calcutta, it's not easily available. In other words, I didn't have a digital map, only calculator. So I actually, what you see here, these red lines, I actually constructed the ward map. That was the first thing. And that, I used ArcGIS to plot this, and then that became the basis for dropping points using the phone app Collector. Okay? What Collector allows you to do is drop points, draw polygons, and draw lines, which were all 3 very useful in thinking about what we can do. One is drop the exact location. That is, you're standing there, you're going to drop a point, and then depending on the extent of the panel, you're going to draw a polygon on the map, on the street map, showing its extent, like its footprint. And then, because panels disrupt normal traffic, the idea was to draw which roads are blocked to vehicular movement and only pedestrian access, to give a sense of how it is affecting that particular site. So, and then I also made a distinction between panels, color-coded. So when you're dropping points, you have to choose one of those colors. Panels on the street are orange, in parks green, in green islands, the little islands between streets are purple, and on vacant lot is blue. And then, as soon as we started doing, there was a lot of discussion about what is vacant land. Vacant land could be actually nobody's building it, but most of them are owned, like they are somebody's property. And we came up with some other discussions about how to characterize what is vacant land in Calcutta. In other words, if an open space in front of an unbuilt structure, they could be a panel. There could be a nominal parking space, could be a panel. But they are actually quite different. Some of them use, let's say, front space of a temple. Okay. Now, there's no other way to describe it except it's a vacant lot, but it's not the same vacant lot as unbuilt, spot in front of a not constructed building, or a part of, where, let's say, in front of a club, okay, and there's just an open space in front of a club. And there's a nominal club room or a nominal library. So the vacant lot became a very interesting sort of designation, and we had to unpack that a lot. Now, this is the data from the 2018 research. We were mapping, more than 2,000 handles. We've also made a decision not to include handles which are within housing estates or, apartment buildings, because they are semi-private, and we were not going to include the ones which are in private residences, because we were only concerned with any space they have easy public access, which also meant that, where my family lives in Kolkata, in Golf Green, though it is considered kind of a housing, estate, there's actually free movement of people. It's not gated, okay? There's no doors, which meant we included that, okay? Because it is really part of the street, to say. Whereas those apartments where there's a, apartment complexes where there's a door, we said no to those. We were not going to try to understand that. Because usually what happens is that some part of the garage is used, or some space in a driveway inside is used. This is not something. We decided to exclude those from our analysis. But when we were doing this, we also had to come up with a way to distinguish between, not simply by color, but giving them unique IDs. So I came up with the idea that, they're going to be, let's say this is W1P14, this is W11P4, which is Ward 11, Handle 4. So every handle has a unique number based on the ward, and then whoever was dropping the point, they could mark whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4 serial. Okay. And then collector allows you to add metadata. So that would include, category 2 means, this is on the street, and then the name of the location, and then some descriptive data, like it's split from W11P3 in 1960, because when they were doing this, they were also actually talking to people. Okay, most of the time, if we can find the people, they're talking with people. This was also to figure out which 14 we should really, hunker down and study more. So, and then there were also photographs which were attached to these. Okay, so kind of think of, I wouldn't call it a thick description, but a substantive metadata description attached to each point, each panel. Any data that was easily available or available. Okay. Now, there are some interesting things we found, and this is one example that we decided to do a detailed analysis. So this is the one, that's the vacant lot business. It's actually in a school building. So this is part of a designated slum area, and this in the far north of Calcutta. It's a designated slum. And they made a very smart decision. They were not going to build a pandal and spend money on it. They were going to refurbish the street that leads to the schoolroom. It's a primary school, and they actually invest a lot in that school. They always use that space because there's no school during Durga Puja, and they decorate it, but there's no added construction costs. So these are some of the things that we came up with. This is how the traffic pattern here through the alleys, and this is the school building. So we came up with very detailed architectural drawings, and yes, they're digital. In other words, we translated them, and I bothered these young people who were working with me to go into extreme details when they were. I said, I want every brick drawn if possible. If a mother is bathing a little child on the, next to her home, I want that drawn. I want every detail. I want to capture something of the lived quality of that space. Do not give me just streets and, boundaries. I want the activities, because the activities of what is happening And that's a particular moment in time, because you're not there all the time, right? But I want that drawn the particular moment in time, because you are capturing one snapshot of that moment of that event. Because I don't want us to think about architectural drawings, which is the typical conceit of architectural drawings or plans, that that plan that you see is for all times, which is not. The plan is not a lived space. Plan is just an abstract description. As lived space, it functions very differently. So when you draw in, this is part based on ethnographic work, observation, you draw in the details of the uses and activity, you get a very different picture of how you can animate that plan, how this these spaces are actually lived. So it had to do with people inside where not only where lights are, light fixtures are, what people are doing, and so on and so forth. Another site, which is also in North Calcutta, it's a very narrow alleyway. One of the things we did here was that we documented and described, and these are all visual drawings, different moments in time. It's actually a very interesting site. It's one of the oldest pujas. It's not any of those really big pujas. It's actually a very modest intervention, and it's people living just around here are the ones who contribute to this. So, and this is already a narrow alley, and then you turn. So let me put it this way: if this cart has to go out, and there's a car coming here, somebody has to wait and watch before this car goes out. It might seem like something very small, but it actually matters when you're building something, when you're using space. In other words, the everyday negotiations that happen when you are living in that space. I often have said when I'm discussing Durga Puja in different venues that very few cities could pull this off every year without any major incidents. Because, and I always say, you couldn't pull this off in London. You won't be able to. It's like pulling off an Olympic Games every year. It would be structurally impossible. Partly it's the kind of regulations that govern public space. Partly is you have to be used to making certain accommodations in public life, in your neighborhood, on an everyday basis. Otherwise you cannot, it would always seem merely an intrusion. It is not something that you can own and you can celebrate and you can accept as deviation from the norm of everyday. In other words, it requires a certain habit of thinking about public space as multi-vocal, as shareable, as not my own. My doorstep is really not my own. It actually belongs to the community. One has to enter into that thinking, otherwise you cannot celebrate this. You cannot hold these things. Which is not to say there are not deep arguments about these things. We discussed many things. In terms of, we were interested in a lot of different factors, including the planning and the process of planning, the process of construction, which means it involves the organizers, it involves the designers, it involves the workers, and the design and the labor and the materials, how the sheer number of materials that converge on Calcutta during this event is unfathomable. Just the number of, you just calculate how many poles of bamboo do you require. It is mind-boggling. Once you start doing the calculations, you would go, how does this happen? And it actually happens without much of a fuss, really. You really have to have an extremely, what I call, strong informal infrastructure to enable this. And Calcutta, you might know, like many other, Indian cities, we wouldn't give in terms of its road infrastructure or any other infrastructure, but it works. And I'm interested in how it works. What is that nature of this, I'm calling it ephemeral event, that is not only works, but works well, and without any major, major problems. And we were interested in sort of impact of this. There is an environmental, it's a huge waste management problem. There's an environmental impact which is not to be taken lightly. But it also, one of the findings, and I will discuss those tomorrow, is that this gives some neighborhoods and some wards a visibility that they would never otherwise have. It almost reverses the importance of the wealthy wards as opposed to the not wealthy wards in terms of demographics. And it's quite fascinating. It's actually counterintuitive. You would think the wards where there are more people are, have such economic, they can afford these things, and they have certain disposable income, you'll find. It's actually not true. Durga Puja acts as a great equalizer. And most of the pujas are not in the traditional wards. The richest wards have the fewest pujas, and the other wards have more. Not that I'm saying the most, dispossessed ones have the most. That's not what I'm saying. So I'm going to talk about the findings later. I want to, I think, stop here today. Oh no, there's a couple of more things I want to show. One is that, it's very important to recognize that there is also temporality across the year. It's not just a 5-day. In other words, how the planning happens in terms of the big budget pujas as opposed to the small ones, which are very temporarily, they could be just a few months, but the big budget pujas start the day puja ends, they start again. That's kind of a thing. But there's also like daily temporal dimension, that what you will find, whether it's the crowds, etc., in the big budget pujas, is very different in terms of the crowd swell and the emphasis, and sort of think of how people are congregating in a city if you want to map that, as opposed to the ordinary ones, and most of them are ordinary. Okay, and in other words, it is a very differentiated geography. It is not homogeneous. Okay. So I was initially interested very much in the dispersal pattern, distribution and dispersal, two things you can actually analyze from a map like this. And then came up with all sorts of interesting ways of thinking about how to kind of describe this phenomenon. I might show these. Abhishek, I believe I am out of... Okay, so I have a few more minutes? Okay. So I wanted to show you some ways I started thinking about it in terms of both assembling the material and then what to do with the material, assembling the research plan and then assembling the material. I like sketching. It's my old habit as trained as an architect. So I would think about how to, and these are some diagrams showing how I'm thinking about little elements coming together as kind of overlays, and then how you can extract one, and you could do that with digital maps. You can have layers which you can remove and then overlay to show sort of think of it as thickness of the event, okay, in terms of the physical structure. And then also thinking about, this was kind of important to me, is that, how many, and we have all the numbers in terms of how many are on the street as opposed to a vacant lot, etc. Anyone who knows Calcutta, it might not come as a surprise, is that the southern suburban wards have the greatest number on vacant lots, because it remains the most unplanned, if you will. Unplanned is not a good term, but it captures what I'm trying to say. In other words, the built interventions are more built interventions have a pattern that allows for a lot more vacant lots than any other parts of the city. And they also have less of parks, fewer parks. The roads are, can get very congested, as we were talking about yesterday. They can be the arteries. There are a lot of traffic on those. So the preferred locations are actually the so-called vacant lots, and there are all kinds, right? So what I'm trying to say, though, the reason I had undertaken a digital project is because would not have been physically possible to map them if I were doing analog method. Okay? I needed something that would enable me to record the structures fast within a given time frame. So we began about a week before, and then stopped. You kind of stop the day after. Okay? And during the puja, it's very difficult to do any kind of work because of the traffic and so on and so forth. But we did. But we did also follow this up, as I said. In 2019, we did some more wards in detail, not just individuals, 14 sites. We did 4 wards in detail, and in 2022, which was very successful, we selected 3 wards based on entirely different demographics, and those are Ward 87, which is in the southern part of Calcutta. It's one of the more well-to-do wards. Then Ward 57, which extends from the central part of the city across what is called the wetlands and goes into the wetlands. In other words, crosses the road that leads to the airport, and it is an extremely variegated landscape. It also was very much an industrial landscape, and now has a kind of again differentiated occupation between middle classes, slum dwellers, and again, it's very, very, very different. And then Ward 10, which I showed you an example of, which is one of the oldest traditional wards of Calcutta, which has a particular, discernible 19th century structure. So we selected 3 which were, again, demographically, topographically, and in terms of also the relation between land and water were very different. We were interested in that. So that was, and then we did very in-depth interviews with folks, including vendors at the site, including the fixtures of neighborhoods. We were thinking in terms of para. Fixtures of neighborhoods, the istriwalas who do the ironing for every neighborhood, because they are the constants in those neighborhoods. For the grocer, not just talking to the organizers or designers or even the workmen, but the people who actually live in that neighborhood and in different service capacity, to understand what their view, because everybody has a different view of this, right? There's no reason to assume everybody thinks it's hunky-dory or everybody thinks it's a great opportunity. While the responses are overwhelmingly positive in terms of how they feel about it, there's still clearly classed, and it's mostly classed distinction of how people respond to the event. And this is, whenever you're doing a project like that, luckily I recognized it early on, you have to have naming authority. When you're doing place names, you have to decide how things are going to be placed. And Indian place names are notoriously differently spelled. Okay. Because Indian last names are very differently spelled. Okay. So street names could be spelled differently, neighborhoods could be spelled differently. So I came up with a very long list of how, the vocabulary basically. Okay. And I will say, despite my insistence that everybody follows that, when people are doing work fast, they were not abiding with that, which means an enormous cleaning up task that remains once you have the data. Believe me, if you ever do a project like that, you'll spend many, many more time cleaning up the data than what you did to collect it. But these were some of the things that we said, the rubrics and keywords, what we were looking at in terms of streeted, in terms of sociality and effect, in terms of infrastructure. And I personally was very invested in understanding what is, the Bengali term is para, or neighborhood. And I'll discuss that tomorrow. I want to stop here and take some questions if you have them.